I'm going to begin by saying that it's probably fair to say that the issues that gave rise to the two revolutions were already in various stages of gestation throughout the country at the time the respective Maidans came into being. And the Maidan itself, the Maidan Square, provided only the physical space and the critical setting where these often diffuse notions of resentment, opposition, and even revulsion and anger coalesced into a critical mass of tangible human expression. As I recall, for the people on the Maidan itself, the crystallization of these feelings was at the same time electrifying, exhilarating, empowering, and all this eventually posed a threat to the political regime of the day. Both regimes, Kuchma's and Yanukovych's, perceived the Maidan as a threat, and to a significant degree it was how the regimes reacted to this threat, rather than the inherent capacity of the Maidan themselves, that ultimately determined whether and how the individual revolutions eventually took off. As Roman had mentioned, living and working in Kyiv, I had the privilege of actually witnessing and experiencing both Maidans, often on a daily basis for weeks on end at a time. In and of itself, that doesn't make me any type of an authority on the events that took place, but they certainly provided me with some unique insights into the atmosphere, the individual behavior, and certainly the crowd dynamics that form the background of many of the events, some of them tragic, that we have come to know and remember. So I'm going to take a bit of a different tact from my colleagues here on the panel, because I'm going to basically share with you my impressions in my presentation, although they are going to be touching on the two Maidans themselves. Admittedly, there are many aspects to the Maidan that one can focus on. For the purposes of my presentation, I'd like to restrict myself to three topics, which may or may not be the most significant ones, but they're certainly among those that easily lent themselves to observation. The first, for me, was the role of the students, participation of the university students. The second was the role of the churches. And the third was the gradual evolution and transformation of the defendants of the Maidan into the combatants that formed some of the first battalions that left Kyiv and went on to fight in the Donbass. Beginning with the students. I still vividly recall the first impressions of the Orange Maidan and the debates and discussions I had with many of my local friends and co-workers about the noticeable lack of student participation and the potential significance of their absence. To be sure, there were indeed many students who ventured onto the Orange Maidan, but they were largely the curious, the adventure seekers who often relished the game of defying their university rectors to attend daily rallies at the risk of being caught and evicted from university, and many of them were. This was still 2004, and the Kuchma regime of the time had the political will and certainly ample administrative resources at their disposal to harass and police the many university campuses around the country. But for someone like myself who had just managed to catch the tail end of the student protest movement in North America in the late 1960s, I found it hard to imagine how the Orange Maidan could succeed if the prime beneficiaries of this unrest weren't participating and they weren't instrumental about bringing about the very changes that would benefit their particular future. More disconcerting to me were the conversations that I often had with local Maidan activists, mostly my age, who didn't see any merit or the need for the students. Certainly no need for them to participate in large numbers, as they felt, as did their parents, that the Ukrainian students don't really understand the issues of the election, and besides, they should be studying and cashing in on their parents' investment rather than roaming the streets, waving placards, and banging on the various oil drums around the Maidan area. I thought this to be a strange conclusion, and it led me to question very early on whether the Orange Revolution could gain enough traction and momentum to drive any significant sustainable reform in Ukrainian society, and this is quite apart from the election itself. And as it turned out, there was no massive student participation that I can recall, and certainly none of the organized variety where the individual university was clearly identified by name and location, although there may have been some effort by the Kyiv Mohila Academy to certainly advertise its presence. Some writers have even gone on to comment on this lack of organized student participation back in 2004. Despite the obvious similarity of having thousands of people on the streets, the social fiber of the two revolutions were quite different. The Orange Revolution, as many have said, was extremely political, middle class, organized by politicians, It had purely political demands and politicians as its leaders. But many things changed during the intervening 10-year period leading up to last year's Euromaidan. For one thing, the student bodies of 2014 were steeped in the memories of the Orange Revolution. Although they were too young to participate themselves, those students had been raised in a domestic environment where the memories of the Orange Revolution were sustained, romanticized, discussed, and perhaps even pilloried, but never forgotten. And therefore it came as no surprise, to me at least, that among the first to take to the streets in November 2013 were the students. A lady by the name of Irina Bekeshkina, probably well known to some of you, the director of the Democratic Initiatives, a policy research center in Kyiv, had observed at the time that unlike the 2004 mass rallies that were driven by mostly middle-aged people, university students were the key force this time around in the Euromaidan. Initially, as we all know, what brought them out into the streets was the dashed expectation of Ukraine signing a landmark political free trade agreement with the European Union. But even so, their numbers at the time were not large, and their demands seemed rather vague and romantic at the time. Slogans such as "Ukrainians are Europeans," "Give us a chance to live in Europe," "Ukraine belongs in Europe," and so on. But lacking any particular focus to their demands, the whole protest seemed doomed to fizzle. Fizzle in a few days as everyone would go back to their daily student routines. But we all remember what happened next. For reasons not yet fully understood, the authorities gave the command to mop up the student Maidan on the evening of November 30th and clear the territory ostensibly so that they could finish erecting the Christmas tree that annually graces the Maidan area during the New Year's holidays. But it was the violence and the brutality with which this small group of students were attacked on November 30th that served as the catalyst for the students to come out en masse to Independence Square in the following days. And this was their defining moment. Had the students stayed home, it was all over. The fact that they came out signified to me that the students of Ukraine had become deeply radicalized overnight. At this point, the students' cause was also taken up as a rallying cry by the population at large, as everyone was shocked by the brutality directed at this small group of students, and this resonated with everyone in the country who had a beef with the regime. Immediately, the demands had changed. Now there were calls for the resignation of both the Prime Minister and the President, and to drive home the point, they organized a million-man march in downtown Kyiv for the Sunday of December the 8th, a week later. As I recall these events, what really stands out in my mind is the energy of the students, the sense of purpose, the aversion to being manipulated by the political opposition, Batьківщина, Svoboda, and the National Front. And even for a brief time, there was some hostility directed towards the political symbols of these three political parties whenever they appeared on the Maidan. Instead, the Maidan became flooded by the national colors of the Ukrainian flag, the red and black flag of UPA, and that of the European Union. The Euromaidan went on to reflect a more profound social shift in Ukraine. It became more of a grassroots movement where politicians had to play on an equal footing now, not only with civil society, but especially with the students and their strong campus followings. The symbols of such universities were everywhere, and it became a matter of pride and inclusivity to have the university name displayed in some prominent place on the Maidan itself. It often helped that the university rectors and deans supported their students, as this only served to legitimize and embolden their cause, something that was completely lacking during the Orange Revolution. And it seems only fitting that when the dust settled on the Euromaidan, the president of a key university which supported the Maidan became the new Minister of Education and Science, Serhiy Kvit, from the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. As we all know, the rapid pace of events superseded the beatings of the students, and the Maidan eventually morphed into a much more determined, harsher, and even aggressive protest, with regime change as its ultimate objective. As the weeks went on, one could sense how the students and even the EU objectives were gradually fading from public attention as new beatings, torture, and the tragedy of the Nebesna Sotnya finally eclipsed the initial student protest movement altogether. Given the additional tragedies that have since befallen the Ukraine, one can't help but wonder what the future will hold for this new generation of radicalized youth. Although the student protests were a compelling part of the Euromaidan narrative, Subsequent events in Ukraine have raised the question of whether they will become a lost generation as well. The war with Russia, as we all know, is still a work in progress, and Ukraine's economy is precariously hanging in the balance. This latter event, I think, should help frame the legacy of the student movement on the Maidan, and there are many unanswered questions in this regard. Chief among them is the question of whether this generation of educated Ukrainians possess the required skills and training that will be needed during the rebuilding phase that will hopefully follow. Will the disproportionately high number of graduates in the humanities and the marketing managers be able to find their new place in a post-war economy? These and many other issues remain open questions with no easy answers, and as the economy continues to deteriorate, these are precisely the questions that these students are asking themselves today. Next item I'd like to touch on is the churches, the role of the churches in both revolutions and how I and others perceive them on the Maidan. Now, to be fair, I'm only going to be commenting on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, both the Kyiv Patriarchate and the Moscow Patriarchate, and to some extent the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as well. The representatives of the other faiths made no impression on me during the respective revolutions, although their solidarity with the Euromaidan was clearly and certainly noted and appreciated during the ecumenical services that took place regularly between December 2013 and February 14, a period of 3 months, which were the critical months of the Euromaidan. By way of some background to this topic, since Ukraine became independent in 1991, the three main churches had what you might call a traditional accommodating relationship with each presidential administration leading up to the Orange Revolution. And they largely restricted their concerns to materialistic issues, such as lobbying their respective pet building projects rather than pursuing any social or human rights issues on behalf of the population. Even the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which historically was more advanced both in its social teaching and action, didn't see fit to disturb the Kuchma regime with issues of political morality, even after the Gongadze slaying. Participation in civil society was not yet a role which any of the three churches had defined for themselves in any meaningful way. There didn't seem to be anything unusual in this, and I don't recall anyone openly calling for or expecting the churches to play any active role in the Orange Revolution back in 2004. Some anecdotal and journalist references were made at the time to the Moscow Patriarchate designating Yanukovych as the endorsed Orthodox candidate and calling upon the faithful to pray for his election victory. But this all seemed rather awkward and unfamiliar territory even for them, and the wider population didn't seem to take it seriously as well, and it sort of ended at that. Unlike Euromaidan, I don't recall any senior clergy from any church addressing the Orange Maidan, and if there were any clergy there, I would guess this was more a case of curiosity rather than an expression of any conviction, pro or con, for what the Maidan at the time stood for. But behind the scenes, I suspect there were cases of internal turmoil in all three churches. But if it wasn't, then certainly the results of the Orange Revolution undoubtedly forced these churches to reconsider their detached relationship from the social and political issues that were brewing in Ukraine at the time, all of which became readily apparent 10 years later. By the time Euromaidan emerged in 2013, a new social activism was emerging in Ukraine where suddenly the churches themselves became active players in civil society. In one fateful night alone, the Kyiv Patriarchate emerged to become a leading spiritual force supporting the Maidan when they gave the order to open up St. Michael's Monastery, to grant shelter to the students who were fleeing the Maidan from the Berkut police, who were dismantling their tents and their camp on the Maidan itself. And this was subsequently followed in later weeks when on individual nights they were ringing church bells in the middle of the night to warn and recruit people to come out to the Maidan and protect it from impending attacks by the police, which were anticipated at that time. Now, such overt acts of defiance to state authority were supplemented by regular appearances on the Maidan stage by Patriarch Filaret of the Kyiv Patriarchate and Metropolite Sviatoslav of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, who gave inspirational sermons during these Sunday rallies, and especially during the so-called March of Millions, which were, by the way, televised nationally on opposition television channels at that time. Moreover, both prelates gave frequent TV interviews where they rebutted the frequently hostile attacks and the Ruski Mir pronouncements emanating from Patriarch Kirill's office in Moscow. By this time, the Maidan, the Euromaidan, had turned into a self-organized and self-policed permanent base camp with regular food deliveries, medical services, sewage and garbage disposal, and zero-tolerance alcohol consumption was strictly enforced. It didn't come as much of a surprise then to see that the churches, in this case the Kyiv Patriarchate and the Greek Catholic Church, became affected by this newfound social activism, and they very quickly erected their own army tents and converted them to chapels where they conducted services round the clock for the Maidan inhabitants. The Moscow Patriarchate, by comparison, did not participate in any formal way at all, but enough of their priests individually visited the Maidan daily that one was left with the impression that they were either a bit confused or that there was already grassroots support for the Maidan itself. I can also speak on the issue of the Kyiv Patriarchate, where a colleague of mine at the time was deeply involved with fostering greater contact between the Kyiv Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. And as he mentioned to me, although the wheels of orthodoxy tend to move very slowly through the course of history, he assured me that Constantinople took and is still taking a very strong interest in what is developing in Ukraine. In particular, the Euromaidan and related events offered Constantinople an opportunity to restate their historical claim for canonical jurisdiction over Kyiv and Ukraine's territory. This was almost in defiance of Moscow's assertions. And this they managed to telegraph publicly on several occasions in not too subtly worded proclamations. Understandably, this all led to great consternation in Moscow, and Moscow's patriarch's worst fear is that Constantinople may eventually recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kyiv Patriarchate and also the self-proclaimed patriarchal status of its primate to assume that patriarchal position. And it may be one of these quirks of history that the Euromaidan, as a secular event, may have brought this event a little bit closer. Euromaidan also became a bit of a two-way street, and it'll be interesting to see how the Maidan phenomenon now will serve to empower the hierarchies of all three confessions as they strive to redefine themselves and their own relationship to the Ukrainian state going forward. But this is obviously a separate topic that's worthy of a separate symposium all of itself. I'm going to conclude with some comments about the volunteer battalions, and it may be a curious topic for some as to why we chose to single them out, but if you bear out and listen to me, I'll give you some justification why I think it's important. As I mentioned at the outset, the two revolutions had many similarities as well as some significant differences, and one of the similarities was the self-policing character of both Maidans, which in my opinion had less to do with any superior moral or ethical standards of the participants than with the pragmatic requirements of keeping out agent provocateurs and alcohol-infused troublemakers who could easily discredit the protesters and give the authorities additional reasons to disperse the Maidan by force. But the comparison largely ends there, as beyond policing the periphery of the barricades, there wasn't much else for the defenders to do during the Orange Revolution. The threat of attack by the police authorities never reached the levels that of the more recent Euromaidan, and there were no auxiliary reasons to protect participants, as widespread abductions and torture by the authorities were not an attribute of the Orange Maidan under Kuchma. However, both the authorities and the protesters drew some valuable lessons from the early Maidan experiment during the Orange Revolution. For the protesters, the lesson was that it wasn't enough to maintain a secure encampment in the center of the city. It was equally important to protect or project pressure on the authorities and government buildings beyond the Maidan, and even at the places, the residence of the high government officials. This latter event gave rise, as you all know, to the Automaidans, which drew strength from numbers, but were still largely exposed as they had very few, if any, means available to protect themselves beyond the Maidan itself. In addition, by the time of the Euromaidan, the authorities were increasingly overplaying their cards by resorting to escalating steps of violence, which was having the complete opposite effect to the intended result. So just as the beatings of the students on November the 30th had the effect of bringing out more students in the following days, the killings on Hrushevsky Street at the beginning of December brought out even more volunteers, this time with military backgrounds, and the abductions on the Automaidan participants led to the creation of protection convoys. As I remember it, with each wave of violence, one could actually see the character of the Euromaidan change and very quickly begin to resemble a military encampment, complete with army tents emblazoned with the names of self-proclaimed regiments, and hundreds of men in camouflage parading around, some in balaclavas, and all of them carrying some form of baseball bat weapon, ostensibly for their own protection. The growing number of such units led naturally to the need for some form of cooperation and coordination. And very quickly, an organizational structure emerged, complete with a commandant at the head of the Maidan Council, where the newly minted Oboronni Sotni were all individually represented. I recall my first impression was that this was rather chaotic and a bit unsustainable, with all these loosely coordinated paramilitary units running around, when one block away, on either side of the Maidan, life continued on pretty much as normal. The cafes were open, the restaurants were working, everything, at least the outward appearance, was very, very normal. It was only when the Afghan veterans arrived and made their presence known by taking up a position near the Maidan's commandant, or the Maidan commandant's tent, that the whole Maidan organizational structure suddenly took on an air of credibility, seriousness, and permanency. Historians, I think, will need to delve into this and do some serious research into the role of the Afghan veterans, as, in my opinion, they provided some very, very valuable service by helping to diffuse tension between the police authorities and the Maidan leaders, as they always kept unofficial channels of communication open during critical times of the standoff. One must remember that many of these Afghan veterans knew a lot of the commanders on the other side of the lines. And it was very, very fortunate, I think, on several occasions that they were able to explain each other's position very well, notwithstanding whatever nakaza they were getting from the president's office at the time. However, as we all know, events eventually escalated out of hand. And the violence began to spin out of control between February the 18th and the 20th, leading to the tragedy on Institutska and the deaths of the Nebesna Sotnya. What was again significant to me was the increasing numbers of new protesters the violence was attracting, and that these were for the most part physically fit young men, many with previous police or military experience. Once the Yanukovych regime collapsed, these volunteer units quickly assumed a civic protection role and began to patrol the city of Kyiv with regular police detachments. However, this was clearly not the role that many of these men had volunteered for, and it was only the subsequent annexation of Crimea and the insurgency in the Donbass that provided them with the necessary rationale which aligned their distinctive Ukrainian patriotism with a clearly defined military objective. In point of fact, many of the defenders on the Maidan did indeed announce their desire to form battalions and to go fight in the Donbass, all of which inspired even more men around the country to do likewise, whether they had been on the Maidan or not. Most had not. And in time, the number of volunteer battalions grew to surprising numbers, at least they're surprising to me. Today, I understand there are approximately 40 to 50 such battalions with an unknown number of counterinsurgency units operating behind these separatist lines with the appropriate name of Tini, or shadows. Two of the more famous battalions are local grown. They didn't participate on the Maidan. Aidar in Luhansk is named after a river in the Luhansk area, and the Azov on the Azov Sea. Both battalions are formed from local Ukrainian residents there, many of whom are, well, all of them are Russian speakers, but some are even Russian citizens. So it gives you an idea of the broadening of this whole issue of protection of Ukraine, evolving initially from the defense of the Maidan. It'll be interesting to follow the continued evolution of these battalions, especially if Ukraine's defense command continues to incur battlefield losses, such as the ones that we witnessed in Ilovaisk, Donetsk airport, and now Debaltseve. Obviously, many different scenarios could still play out in the months ahead. However, assuming Ukraine prevails, it will be interesting to see whether these Maidan-inspired soldiers will eventually be absorbed into existing military units of the Ukrainian army, or whether they will acquire some as yet unknown permanent status as auxiliary units, which have no parallel in European countries. In summation, I would like to state that given the abstract notion of such issues such as dignity and the general lack of emotional attachment to such concepts as economic and political reform, I'm tempted to conclude here that the Euromaidan and the so-called Revolution of Dignity will be remembered in history less for the European values and the intangible reforms that it may or may not spawn, but more so for the fact that the Maidan acted as a catalyst for reviving a long-forgotten Ukrainian tradition of being willing to sacrifice and die for the defense of one's country. The Euromaidan was a complex movement that went through several distinct phases of development. However, in terms of historical impact, the present existential conflict for Ukraine's identity and physical survival as a nation will likely, I think, trump any other issue that may have arisen on the Maidan itself. Physical resistance and the spontaneous birth of the volunteer battalions leading to the formation of a new Ukrainian army will, I think, be the long-lasting legacy of the Euromaidan. Anyway, some food for thought on that subject. Thank you.